The Hunt Institute, as you know, just by way of preface, produces pragmatic, actionable data and regulatory tools for the regional economy, that is for New Mexico, West Texas, and Chihuahua. And the issue is that we are living in a region that is bisected by various market structures. And as we'll see here in a minute, the finance and banking sector is just another example of how those markets diverge. And the consequence of living in a region that is divided between different markets means that we lose a lot of opportunities for scale, and investment of scale, risk, investment risk increases, and there's also other deleterious effects that result from that. So what we try to do at the Hunt Institute is remediate those kinds of challenges and those kinds of differences. So we collect a lot of regional data from the 3 states and the 2 countries that surround us, but we also do regulatory analysis. And what Dr. Fullerton mentioned earlier that you're going to see here today is a bit of regulatory and quantitative information of our financial and banking systems in Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua. This is going to be published in a sector analysis that follows the tradition of what we did earlier with the energy sector, and it should be available later this spring. What I always start with, and as I just did, is the contested nature of the territory that surrounds us and in which our community lies. And this is a map from the post-U.S.-Mexico War, and the naming of disputed territory, I think, is quite important. And the reason that territory and our territory has been and still is quite disputed is because if you look at the map, you see that El Paso, and that white dot is White Sands, is very geographically remote. And so it's very arduous to get things in and out of this region. So costs increase, trade becomes more cumbersome. But the strategic advantage of this region is that we are literally at the crossroads of this continent from U.S. to Mexico, as well as from the Pacific ports and the Gulf ports and the Midwest ports. That means that everybody sort of wants to have a piece of action in this territory. Now, the other thing to remember is banking and finance, and as I'll mention in a second, goes hand in hand with trade. And the principal mover of trade in the last 100 years in our region has been the railroads, and in fact was the origin of banking in El Paso in our region as we know it. This is a banknote from the Banco de Santa Eulalia, which was the first bank outside of Mexico City to publish or to circulate notes, which was in actually Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua, Chihuahua City. And if you see there on the banknote is printed the railroad. This then also is a banknote from the first bank from Ciudad Juarez, El Banco Minero Chihuahuense. And you see there on the banknote that this is from 1880. This is the same year that all the railroads in our region were becoming transcontinental railroads. This is when Deming became the locus of the Second Transcontinental Railroad, and also the same year that the railroad I just showed earlier reached Mexico City to Ciudad Juarez. This is a banknote from the First National Bank of El Paso. And as many of you know who are from this region or longtime residents of this region, this was the first bank in El Paso and eventually came to be bought out by Wells Fargo after it was Norwest Bank. Now, this also means that our region has different market actors present. And these are the major banks in Mexico at a national level. And if you'll notice, most of those banks are foreign banks. And Mexican banking system is dominated by foreign banks. And this is also true in Ciudad Juarez, which we'll see in a second. The other thing to remember about the Mexican banking system is that it has a very streamlined regulatory structure. This is something we also saw with the energy markets. The energy markets in the United States are primarily regulated at the state level. So you see a lot of divergence in terms of oversight, in terms of regulation and approvals. But in Mexico, you have one federal unified system, and that's the same. So the primary regulators of banking and finance in Mexico are the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público, Banco de México, y la Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores. And in fact, I must also express my gratitude to these institutions who have been very helpful and eager to work with us on the production of this report. So now we're getting a little bit into the details here, and I think what the data will show us is that there are stark divergences in not only the way the markets are structured, but in how those different market structures create different valuations and different magnitudes of indicators. This is a recent analysis of the banking institutions, commercial banks in Ciudad Juarez. And as you can see here, there is just one type of bank class, this nationally regulated bank, and they have one primary regulator, and then we have the total deposits and their market share. Now, if you look at the top 5 banks, you'll see that, again, most of those are foreign banks. It is just Norte, ICSE, that is not a foreign bank. And we can also see here the kind of market concentration in Ciudad Juarez of certain players. We also have analyzed the relative importance of Ciudad Juarez deposits to other Mexican cities bordering Texas. And as we see here, that of the other Mexican municipalities bordering Texas, Ciudad Juarez is by far and away the leader. Now, we also did some analysis here with cash transactions in the U.S. In U.S. dollars in Mexico by financial institutions. And as many of us know, as business people and as regulators and as bankers here in the region, this dollarization issue is really affecting us. Again, going back to that issue of divided territories and disputed territory. So the availability for Mexican institutions to take dollars has decreased significantly over the years, and there are some exceptions. But the federal regulation really affects border communities, including Ciudad Juarez, and negatively affects its economy. At the U.S. level, these are the major banks that are working in the United States. Now, the interesting thing is that the presence of these corporate banks and the market concentration is relatively recent. It wasn't very long ago. In the U.S. right now, there's approximately 5,000 commercial banks. And in Mexico, there's only 48 commercial banks. So if you think of the kind of market diversity and the ability for financial intermediation in the U.S. versus Mexico, the difference is quite stark. But even so, in the United States, just about 30 years ago, there were 40,000 banks. Now, these are the primary federal regulators of the banking and financial system in the United States: the Federal Reserve System, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Office of Thrift Supervision. So even immediately, we're starting to see a divergence in terms of federal regulation and the multiplicity of regulators. This is a map of the Federal Reserve System, and we talk a lot about the U.S.-Mexico border being sort of a barrier to trade and commerce and economies of scale. But interestingly, if we look here at the state of New Mexico, for some reason it's divided between two systems, the Kansas City and the Dallas system. And there's on the left-hand side a map of the Kansas City system and then the Dallas system. And if you just go back for a second and look at where the banks are, where El Paso is, we're quite far. And aside from the El Paso branch of the Federal Reserve System, the closest one you won't find until you get to Denver. Now, at the state level, the two primary regulators of the finance and banking system in New Mexico is the New Mexico Regulation and Licensing Department, the Financial Industries Division. And for the state of Texas, it's the Department of Banking. Now, when we look at the El Paso County banking institutions, we're already struck by the differences from the table for the analysis of Juarez deposits and regulators and market concentration. We see here that there are diversity between national member banks, state member banks, and also your primary regulators and the total deposits. In El Paso, we have around $8 billion worth of deposits in commercial banks, far more than we do in Ciudad Juarez. But again, interestingly, the kind of market concentration in both cities, the percentages are relatively the same across the market leaders. Westar Bank, Compass Bank are sort of the leaders locally, while the other national ones predominate the market. Now, we also did similar comparative analyses with respect to the amount of deposits in Texas and other border counties with respect to El Paso. And while Ciudad Juarez was far and away the leader in the Mexican border communities, Here, it's Hidalgo County. So we're seeing kind of a difference and a lag between El Paso's deposits with respect to the other communities. Now, we also did some analysis with respect to credit unions. And interestingly, the market in El Paso is dominated by federal credit unions, and GCU is a state-regulated credit union. Now, with respect to Doña Ana County banking institutions, this is what the data show us, that total deposits, well, there's also quite a variety of regulatory oversight with respect to those banks, and the total deposits only amount to around $2 billion. So the difference between total deposits in El Paso County and Doña Ana County, again, is quite stark. And again, interestingly, even though we're in a different market or a different county and with different deposits, that market share proportion is not too dissimilar. With respect to New Mexico border communities, relative terms, Doña Ana County is far the leader with respect to the others. Luna County, Hidalgo County, Otero County. It's not on the border, but it's quite close. And with Las Cruces credit unions, there's much fewer than there are in El Paso County, and they're all national. With respect to the growth of real deposits in the region since 2000, we see a strong upward trend, and we saw a spike in 2016. That dotted line is the business cycle mapped against the amount of deposits. And then we have the real deposits also mapped in Doña Ana County. There's no business cycle index created for Doña Ana County. Looks like a good thesis project for one of Dr. Fullerton's students, perhaps. But once we have that, then we can map it as well. With respect to total deposits in the Paso del Norte region, we've compared them here in a bar chart showing how far ahead El Paso County is with respect to the others. Now, one of the other issues with the health of a banking system is ability to intermediate, the financial intermediation. How many people can participate, how difficult or easy it is to open an account, to get a loan, et cetera. The comparative structure, then, of employment in the Paso del Norte region is very important because Ciudad Juarez, really the demographic anchor or the demographic center of gravity in the region, has an informal employment rate that is hovers between 15 and 20, 30, 40%, depending on what measurements you're looking at. So the informality of the labor market in Ciudad Juarez really inhibits a lot of growth in lending and in deposits in Ciudad Juarez, which you could otherwise have a very vibrant, robust market system. Now, the data I'm about to show you here is a quick rundown of sort of the degree to which the Ciudad Juarez and the state of Chihuahua have financially intermediated with respect to other municipalities and states in Mexico. Now, the interesting thing is that the ability to get data for the Mexican financial system is much easier than it is to get for the U.S. system. So all of this data you're about to see is from the Comisión Nacional de Bancaria de Valores. But it's very difficult to get that from the U.S. banking entities. So with respect to the number of commercial branches in Mexico, this is at the national level, we sort of see who are the leaders between 2008 and 2015. Now, these are number of commercial branches in Mexico by state. And you look down there, and Chihuahua is sort of towards the left end of the left third of the graph. And it's somewhere between Tamaulipas and Baja California Norte and Sinaloa. So where then is Chihuahua with respect to these other Mexican states? We have Puebla, Guerrero. Guerrero has more commercial branches per state than Chihuahua does, which is an interesting fact to consider. Now, with respect to per capita branches, Chihuahua is there roughly in the middle of all Mexican states. It is behind states like Morelos, Colima, Querétaro, Sinaloa, Sonora, and Campeche, which is something very interesting because the size of and the value of the Chihuahuan economy is much greater than some of those states. Now, with respect to municipalities in Mexico with more than 100 branches, we have Juarez there right behind Culiacán and right ahead of Chihuahua. But again, Juarez and Chihuahua are kind of sort of in the middle of the pack. And when we think about, again, how important the industrial sector is to Chihuahua, the value-added manufacturing that goes on there and the employment, it's interesting to think about why they're in that position and not higher with respect to other states. Number of commercial ATMs and banks in Mexico has been increasing. Now, this has also been one of the primary policy goals of the Peña Nieto administration, is to increase financial intermediation. Even in Ciudad Juarez, a lot of the financing for the major operations doesn't originate locally, but originates from foreign banks. So how can you get more of the population and more of the labor market involved in the banking system to create something more robust and less dependent on foreign capital? Number of ATMs in Mexico by commercial bank. Number of ATMs in Mexico by state. Chihuahua is sort of, again, at the, whoa, this is a touchscreen. Chihuahua then is again sort of at the end of the top third there, right ahead of Quintana Roo and right behind Coahuila. Percentage of ATMs in Mexico by state, Chihuahua there is doing relatively well compared to other states. Commercial bank branches in Mexican border cities, Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Tijuana, Laredo. Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua City compete more or less with the amount of commercial bank branches in Tijuana and far exceed those in Nuevo Laredo. Commercial banks, ATMs, Ciudad Juarez does better than the others, but Tijuana is doing better than the rest. Now, this is number of ATM branches in Ciudad Juarez, and again, this information is all available from the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, and here we have the number of ATMs and the number of branches at the municipal level in Ciudad Juarez. So this is, again, might seem like a lot of information, but is just merely a preview of what will be contained in the finance and banking sector review, because we can get even municipal data for loans in Ciudad Juarez, something we cannot get in the United States. So again, this issue of financial intermediation means that a lot of people without access to traditional banking resources have to resort to alternative financial services or money services businesses. And they do that regionally on all sides of the border. This isn't just sort of a question of informal employment in Ciudad Juarez, but also in Doña Ana County and El Paso County. And if we think about the labor markets as well in the region, we know that a lot of people are using MSBs and payday loans for financial services that they otherwise couldn't get from banks. So we have here also in our analysis the types and the names of the money services businesses in Las Cruces. Now, the interesting thing a lot of these money services businesses have is that once they get a license from the state, they can nominate a delegate to conduct business in their name. Now, that delegate doesn't have to go through the same regulatory approvals as the actual license holder. So what you can get is a lot of businesses springing up that are in the name of the license holder, but the delegate is operating without such review. Now, the other thing that's interesting to note is to see the headquarters of these money services businesses. And none of them are coming from here in the region, but from far away. Now, with respect to money services businesses in El Paso, we have the same issue with companies and also money transmitters, check cashers, and money changers. Now, there's a big difference in regulation between Texas and New Mexico with respect to payday lenders. And in Texas, the payday lenders are not really subject to the same kind of regulations as they are in New Mexico. In New Mexico, you have limits on interest rates, you have limits on number or the quantity of the loan, but in Texas, you really don't have that restriction. And that's a big issue in the state legislature on an annual basis. We have here the payday entitled loan companies in El Paso and their number of branches. And you see the list was so long that we had to split it up between two slides. And with respect to the payday entitled loan companies in Las Cruces, we also have a great presence of out-of-state headquarters for those facilities. Now, with respect to money transfers, that's another area that people use in order to exchange cash across great distances and borders, not using bank accounts. And this data shows us that real remittances to Mexico by type have been having increased greatly since 2000 and then started to sort of level off and then pick back up again in 2016. And electronic money transfers far and away predominate the market there. Now, this is an interesting program called Directo a Mexico, which is really a service in many ways to Mexicans living in the United States or anybody who wants to send money from the U.S. To Mexico. It has the lowest fees of any market participant in the wire transfer or money transfer sector. And this allows participating banks in the United States to send it to a Mexican postal facility in Mexico in coordination with El Banco de Mexico. And as we can see here, the total transactions have been increasing, and so have generally the amount in U.S. dollars total transactions. Now, the average dollar transaction has increased from around $400 to now $600. Real remittances to Mexican border states. Chihuahua is there, grouped with other states that is sort of near the top. But there's a spike there in Tamaulipas between 2013, 2015. Not really sure why that is, but that's what the data show us. Real remittances to Mexican border municipalities. We have here Ciudad Juárez compared to Tijuana, Mexicali, Reynosa. Ciudad Juárez does not receive as many remittances as Tijuana, for example, but does receive more than the other cities. Real remittances to border cities compared to the rest of Mexico. Border cities get around 230 million. It's been decreasing, as we've seen in the last quarters of 2016. But with respect to Mexico as a whole, it's but a small fraction. Now, a lot of times money in the border is brought over by cash, and a lot of us have heard stories about bulk cash transfers or even bulk cash smuggling. Now, part of really what the virtue of what the Hunt Institute is trying to do is not just show macroeconomic data, but show local, regional data in a macroeconomic lens. So we have even been able to get information here with respect to the remittances at the state level to Chihuahua, as well as to municipalities such as Ciudad Juárez, even places like Aldama, Casas Grandes, and other institutions. Now, this is also part of a project that we're working on with the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, as well as the U.S. Department of Treasury and their representatives at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, which is regarding the divergences and the pressure that money laundering has on the financial sector in our region. This is a map of illicit flows going through the Americas, and as all of us know, El Paso is not just a strategic gateway for legitimate commerce and trade, but also for illegitimate commerce and trade. And there's a lot of pressures that puts on our not only financial system and commercial system, but also on the law enforcement authorities and the people responsible for our public safety. Many of you know that Albuquerque is, for example, suffering a tremendous amount of pressure with respect to organized crime. Now, in our paper, as well as a prior presentation that we gave for the Department of Homeland Security Symposium Series, the same kind of divergences that we see with the supervision and the oversight of the financial sector at the state and federal level with banking is also present with the law enforcement agencies as well. So they are just as divergent and just as split up as the commercial sector. So when we're thinking about not only an economy of scale, but a robust economy of scale, but even a secure economy of scale, it's important that our law enforcement agents and our policymakers have a clear understanding of what's happening, not with respect to commercial flows and illicit flows of finance and in the banking sector, but also the other side of that equation as well. Now, this is a view of North America at night, and I show it at night because you can see how the march of history is moving from the Atlantic coast to the West Coast. And even as we started this presentation, we saw how that over time, as the railroads reached El Paso and as the great trade and logistics infrastructure is moving from the Pacific ports to Atlantic ports to Midwest ports, from central Mexico northward to the United States, El Paso has been and continues to be in the crossroads of this development. So that means that we are in a privileged position to leverage these trade flows, whether they're coming from trans-Pacific trade, inter-Pacific trade, or whether they're coming from inter-Pacific and inter-Atlantic trade. And the great opportunity then for us is to try and find some kind of commonality of data, some kind of commonality of economic structures so that we can really benefit from this and not just be separated by different states and municipalities. So that's just a taste of what's to come, and I thank you for your time and attention, and we'll be happy to take questions after the event today. Thank you very much.